All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS. And as many of you I've seen before, and thanks for coming back for another event. This is part of our virtual book series where we highlight new publications by NACBS members. And today we're going to be hearing from Jacob Ivey about his newest work. I'm just going to briefly introduce Jacob and Michael today and then turn it over to them for a sort of informal discussion. And there will be time at the end for questions, so do keep those in mind. You can either drop them into the chat throughout, or once we open it up for questions, you can go ahead and raise your Zoom hands. So Jacob Ivey is an associate professor of history at Florida Memorial University, South Florida's only HBCU. He received his PhD from West Virginia University, and he teaches African American, and world history and writes on the British Empire in Southern Africa, as well as issues of race in South Africa and the Black diaspora across the globe. His first book, which we're going to be hearing about today, Policing, Race, and the Formation of 19th-Century British Colonial Natal, is published with Palgrave Macmillan's Britain in the World series. And his current project examines the anti-apartheid movements in Florida and their connections to the global anti-apartheid movements of the late 20th century, titled From Sun City to the Sunshine State, Florida and the Anti-Apartheid Movement, from the University of Florida Press. So welcome, Jacob. He's going to be joined today by Michael Silvestri, who is professor of history at Clemson University. He's the author of two books, Ireland and India, Nationalism, Empire, and Memory, with Palgrave Macmillan in 2009, and Policing Bengali Terrorism in India and the World, Imperial Intelligence and Revolutionary Nationalism, 1905 to 1939, with Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. He's the co-author of the textbook Britain since 1688, A Nation in the World. And his research has been funded by grants from the American Philosophical Society and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's currently completing a book manuscript entitled A Country That Has Served the World Well with Police, The Irish Policeman in the British Empire and Beyond, for publication in New York University Press, Glucksman Irish Diaspora Series. So welcome, Jacob and Michael. And Michael, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. And thank you all for coming today for our discussion of Jacob Ivey's new book, Policing Race and the Formation of 19th-Century British Colonial Natal, which was, as Amanda said, was published last year in the Britain in the World series from Palgrave Macmillan. So I'm very excited to talk about Jacob's book, which features rich archival material and many insights into the police and their role in late 19th century colonial society in Southern Africa. And the book also invites us to reflect on the role of police more generally throughout the British Empire in this period, and also in 20th century South Africa. So we can move quickly to Jacob's book. I've kept my remarks very, very brief. But I just want to note it's been over 30 years, nearly 35, I believe, since David Anderson and David Killingray edited two seminal collections on policing within the British Empire. In their introduction to the first of these volumes, Policing the Empire, Government, Authority, and Control, Anderson and Killingray encapsulated how the colonial policeman was, quote, the most visible public symbol of colonial rule in daily contact with the population and enforcing codes of law that upheld colonial authority. And the colonial policeman, whether white or indigenous, stood at the cutting edge of colonial rule. Since the publication of Anderson Killingray's volumes in the 1990s, rich scholarship on the role of the police as an important component of imperial rule has emerged. These myriad books and articles have taken a different perspective on colonial policing than earlier studies, which were often written during the period of British imperial rule, and often, not coincidentally, often written by former imperial policemen, what Jacob has aptly labeled triumphalist narratives of the history of colonial policing. These triumphalist narratives emphasize the successful establishment of law and order, the rule of law, and heroic deeds of most typically British police officers. In contrast, more recent scholarship has emphasized issues such as the ties of policemen to colonial societies, the motivations and aspirations of colonial policemen, whether from the metropole or colony, the use of violence by police forces in order to maintain racial hierarchies and colonial control, and the essentially hybrid nature of colonial police forces, which were the result of a complex and transnational pattern of cross-fertilization between metropole and colonies, rather than the simple imposition of a model of policing, whether the London Metropolitan Police or the Royal Irish Constabulary. Policing race and the formation of 19th century British colonial Natal uh, contributes to this robust scholarship on imperial policing in order to explore the creation, organization, and actions of the police in what Ivey refers to as the formative period of Natal's history, from the declaration of Natal in 1844 as a British territory to the beginning of the South African War in 1899. He demonstrates how the Black Constable was crucial to the formation of colonial Natal and how the system of state control there was more fluid than many historians have previously understood. As Jacob notes, however, while British imperial historians have not neglected by any means the study of indigenous people within institutions such as the police, at the same time, analyses of colonial policing have not always placed indigenous policemen, be they Afro-Caribbean, Black, or Asian, not place them front and center. And this is something that Jacob's book, I believe, does most emphatically and most skillfully as well. It's also a book that recovers the voices and perspectives of colonial policemen, Black Africans, as well as white settlers and recent arrivals from the United Kingdom. And there are some fascinating stories in Jacob's book, whether that of the African constable Budaza, nicknamed Wit Boy or White Boy by his police colleagues, who embraced his role as a colonial policeman and exercised a considerable amount of authority, or the story of the disgruntled British mounted trooper Thomas Joyce, who led a dozen of his comrades to desert their post in order to recover back pay and financial rewards that they believed were rightfully theirs. These stories help us understand the operations of colonial policing on the ground level in 19th century Natal, as well as the connections and tensions between Black African policemen and surrounding society, as well as their relationship with and sometimes surprising bonds that they formed with their white superiors. So I'd like to move on to Jacob, and many questions I could ask you, but could you talk just a little bit first about the genesis of the project and how you came to be studying Black African policemen primarily in Natal in this period?
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. And Michael, thanks for that great introduction. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. I really appreciate it. I'll just say right off the bat, it has been a long and slogging process in many instances. But sort of the initial catalyst associated with it was when I was working on my dissertation well over a decade ago at this point. And the aspirations, as many people in the room who knew me back then could attest, is that my thought process was to do sort of this grand history of sort of police and military defensive institutions within colonial Natal, during this formative period. And I think it's overall successful, but it was also incredibly unwieldy because I was not only looking at white volunteer organizations, I was also looking at indigenous levies that were used by individuals like the Opalist Shepstone. I was looking at the nature of military structures and defensive structures, trying to define what it meant for Natal more broadly. So when I completed my dissertation, I had this large and I think very unwieldy project that I didn't think transferred very well into a book project. So I sensibly, when I got my first academic job, started delving into it and figuring out what works and what needs to work. And I kept coming back to these Black policemen that were within the colony. And I think I realized that this was a group that in many instances had always existed within the periphery of the narrative. We're always there when I talked about instances of insecurity from the colonial settler population, from instances of violence that occurred within the area as a whole. And what really sort of solidified this, and I actually talk about this in the introduction, is that I was after I was done with my dissertation, I was going through H.P. Holt's history of the mounted police in Natal, which, as Michael alludes to, it is one of these, early 20th century triumphalist narratives of the white policeman within the colony as a whole. And I talk about this in the intro. There is this image that is at the center of the book, and it shows this collection of policemen. And when all is said and done, it's this moment where you have these two white policemen who are there and these four black policemen who are surrounding them. And specifically, two of the black policemen are kneeling down next to the dogs that are in theory owned by the white members of this mounted police force. And it's a wonderful image, and it's something that I think encapsulates sort of the power dynamics that are going on. But also too, in this same book, Holt and the foreword by the commandant of the police captain named of Dardanelle, is talking about these brave men, and they never talk about the black policemen who make up the majority of the constabulary within these institutions. And that in many cases became kind of this catalyst for me to essentially say this story needs to be told. And, I was fortunate enough to, begin some archival work. I had a good start of it because an entire chapter of my dissertation was focused on, these police institutions, but I knew I needed more. And I was thrilled that when I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa and the archives of Pietermaritzburg and Durban, that I found those stories. And I think the book itself is filled with those fantastic stories of those individuals. And so I think the catalyst for it was not only knowing that I had the realization that this is a story that needed to be told, but a realization that there are these stories that I think are fruitful and very telling, specifically to this time period for South African history.
And it's yeah, and I completely, as someone who works on colonial policing as well, completely empathize with that, with the issue of the story you're talking about. Whereas as the indigenous policemen, just who, as you point out in Natal and in other colonial contexts too, far outnumber the white policemen in the empire. But there is this kind of curious kind of anonymity about them, certainly in this time period. And I know we had talked about this before, that some scholars even cast doubt on the ability of historians to write a history, say, of black policemen in Southern Africa before the First World War. So because there is just such a relative lack of information about them. So how did you and it's a combination of archival sources, and also it seems that the press reports were very fruitful for your research as well. How did you that they're in the archive, these Black African policemen, but not in the sense that, well, someone writing a history of Black police in Natal would hope. So what kind of approach did you have to take? How did you have to utilize the archive in order to get at these, and the other sources to get at these stories of Black African policemen?
Yeah, and I think one of the really fascinating components when I was sort of digging through the archives on these instances is that when you're going through sources and you're doing your keyword searches, or honestly, when you're just going through just a stack of reports from the police institutions, you basically just need to start looking for the telltale signs that this is a member of the quote unquote native police who is involved in these instances. In most cases, their names aren't provided. In many instances, you just sort of have to read between the lines that these individuals, are involved in these situations. But I think when you do have sort of named individuals, and you have individuals who have a presence within the archives. You just need to lean into it. And you mentioned, it's the basis of an entire chapter. This constable by the name of Budaza, and Budaza. I originally stumbled upon his story when I was looking through some newspaper archives, and I found this sort of fascinating story about this guy who was basically running guns, and this guy by the name of Harcourt who's running guns, illegally into Natal, and this African policeman is the person in the court reports that are being published within the newspaper. He's the primary witness. And he's the central character in this story. And I grabbed onto it because I quickly realized that this was someone who, at the very least, believed in his exceptionalism. There's a wonderful anecdote related to Budaza where ostensibly, he tells the assailant, this gentleman by the name of Harcourt, he tells them, don't you know that I am Witboy, which is, the nickname that he has of the police. And he says, this person should know who I am. This person should know who I am because he has either seen me or he knows the authority that I represent within the colonial structure. And I think the best part about it, I love the best anecdote is Budaza himself admits that he doesn't even have the badge of office when he arrests this guy. But he is so convinced in his authority that he is able to arrest this individual that doesn't matter. And it sort of transcends those racial divisions that exist within that structure. And Budaza actually sort of became like kind of my white whale because he was someone who very much represented this fantastic moment, and he just disappears from the archives. Like there's no other reporting that I'm finding with him. When I was going through police reports in the same area, he doesn't appear within these systems until eventually, just by luck, when I was in the South African archives in Pietermaritzburg, I came across a description of a chief who was attempting to basically retire. And he was trying to pass on, his title to his son and the like. And the name Budaza appears a lot. I mean, it's not an uncommon name in these instances. But it specifically pointed out that Budaza, chief, formerly Nduna, and then former constable to the same resident magistrate that was there. And this was 20 years later, where this individual had gone from this constable to this chief within the system. And that's something that happens. I mean, Jill Kelly has written about this a lot in Swim with Crocodiles as well, that you have individuals who achieve this. But he's the one who I think is the best example of an individual who you can sort of find some evidence from him existing beyond this single moment in the archive. But to answer your question, really, what I had to do was accept the fact that a lot of figures like Budaza are going to appear for these single moments. They're going to appear in depositions for court cases. They're going to appear in reports to local magistrates. They're going to appear for the briefest moments and even more rarely within news articles. But these single moments I can compile and start getting a greater picture of what the life is like, or what the actions are like for the constabulary as a whole, But again, as you rightly point out, and I think as Tim Stapleton actually has said specifically, it's nearly impossible to get a true picture of this, especially because we don't have access to oral interviews in many instances. There are some. But they're not nearly as prominent as they are in sort of the post 19th, 20th century moments.
Right. Absolutely. And even white policemen in this era can be somewhat anonymous figures as well, or at least figures about whom it's difficult to find information. I always think of that the Robert Bickers in his book Empire Made Me talks about how the police makes the point of even if you're a white policeman, you have status, you have power, you have the ability to use violence, but your status in colonial society is low. They're not pucka, as he puts it. And you also we need to talk more about like these issues about the Black African policeman. But also it's not entirely a book about Black African policemen. You saw it, and I think in part to try to uh, puncture some of these triumphalist narratives of the policing in Natal, which are still the main extant scholarship from which you state. You talk about the experience of white policemen, such as this man Joyce, and it does seem like there's a commonality between the experiences of white and black policemen. That they both are, as other scholars have talked about, they are, they're laborers, and they get involved in labor protests and collective protests, and they are very quick to use to point out when they are not getting what they believe is due to them as colonial servants.
Yeah, and Joyce, I think, is a fascinating illustration of sort of what kind of is a theme of the later chapters of the book, is sort of the broken promise that is policing within Natal. And Joyce is a part of this first iteration of the Natal Mounted Police. And anyone who knows sort of the history of of Natal, knows that the Natal Mounted Police kind of have this almost iconic status within a lot of settler narratives. Not only are they taking part in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, but they're involved in the South African War. I think the Natal Mounted Police, like their big claim to fame is that when Napoleon III's son gets killed in Natal, like they escort his mother to see the site of his murder, and by the Zulus in these cases, or killing more accurately. So they have this kind of spot within the imagination. But when it started, I mean, it really is just a ragtag force that's just an idea. It's based on, Walter Curry's, Cape Frontier Mounted Police, just because, they think that, oh, it worked over there, why not here? And Joyce is this guy he's part of the police institution within England, and basically gets recruited to come to South Africa saying, start a new life, have a new opportunity, come to this land where you can make something great. And within a few months, he realizes he's kind of been had. The promises of pay, the promises of compensation for bounties and the like, just simply don't materialize. And Joyce, I think, like many individuals would in this instance, just says, well, this isn't for me. And, in 1866, he basically gathers up about a dozen of his buddies and says, okay, we're going to go, to the colonial capital in Pietermaritzburg and say, hey, we want to get paid because we're not getting paid. And you're right, it's very much a labor action that they take part in. And it leads to, their dismissal, and then a series of trials where, frankly, Joyce, and I think it's partially because of his experience, I think partially because of his own personal charisma, he wins this trial, gets a pretty healthy severance from the colonial government. Well. Yeah, and he does pretty well. And on top of that, like, he goes on and he finds jobs within the colonial police. He finds jobs in other elements of the corporate police systems within Pietermaritzburg and Durban and the like. And he succeeds. Versus, on the other hand, there's this guy by the name of Albert Stent, who he's one of these guys who also attempts to leave. And he also has a trial. And from all appearances, he doesn't win his trial. Maybe because he has a different jury, maybe because he's not nearly as charismatic, but the guy's life just kind of falls apart. He's never able to find a job. He's never able to get steady employment. His wife leaves him, probably because he isn't a great guy. And eventually he gets thrown in jail, and he kind of disappears from the records after that, but we can kind of assume he probably dies in a ditch somewhere. And this, I think, these stories are so interesting because, again, as you said, Michael, it goes against this kind of triumphalist narrative that often comes along in the recollections 20, 30, 40, 50 years later by people like H.P. Holt and, the former Commandant Dartnell, who's saying, oh, well, these boys were a little rough and tumble, but damn it was the best years of our lives. And at the same time, though, what I really liked was these instances of civil unrest or, labor disputes. This also happens within the Black population.
Mhm.
About 2 decades later, in the 1880s, there's a collection of African policemen who essentially tried to petition for better clothing, better greatcoats. And if anyone's been up in the Drakensberg Mountains in the winter, I mean, it gets pretty flipping cold. And these are individuals who are basically giving greatcoats, instead of once every year, eventually comes 2, sometimes 3 years, where by the time it's 18 months in, they're shredded, they're tattered in these instances. And these Africans get together and they write a petition and they basically try to, again, give a point of collective action on these instances. And that's something I think that if you were just looking at just the Black police or just the white police in those instances, you don't see those parallels that exist. And again, that's why it's not a book. When I tell people, it's not a book that's just about Black police. It's about policing race and the formation of 19th century colonial Natal, because these two groups act in many ways, all right, parallel to one another. And even though sometimes they don't directly cross within the narrative, I mean, they're still existing in the same world. They're still existing within the same systems of administration, the same systems of policing. And they are, without a doubt, I think, very much illustrative of the incredible complexity that exists within these systems of colonial rule.
Absolutely, and just an imperial policing aside, that at the Royal Irish Constabulary Depot, when colonial officers were coming to train there in the first decade of the 20th century, they had these greatcoats that they would lend to officers who came from Fiji or northern Nigeria, because the Dublin winters were cold. So I can't imagine the Drakensberg Mountains without an adequate greatcoat. But to and this is a couple of points I could build on, but one that struck me when I was rereading your book was about the multiple. On the one hand, that you said there's the arc of your book is that it's the broken promises of policing. Also, these efforts to, in a sense, professionalize policing to improve it while still not spending any money on it, which was, of course, entirely typical of colonial administration. So one thing that struck me was the multiple roles that police were asked to take on, that they had. I mean, police duties in the colonies tended to be more expansive anyway, but there seemed like there was just this automatic assumption that if you were a policeman, you were a jailer as well. And that this was, I think, both sought by some officers, white officers, as a career path, but also a way that police were deployed, and illustrates the coercive nature of the colonial regime.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing about this is, and Michael, you've written about this, and it's just this idea of anyone writing with policing about is that obviously, like, the increase of policing is also the increase of criminality, and it's the increase of sort of the emphasis on attempting to address issues of criminality. And of course, one of the big components of criminality is, okay, what do you do once you've captured the criminals? Like, well, what do you do once you have these individuals who are apprehended? And of course, that's you put them in some sort of confinement. And the evolution of what's happening in Natal during this period is very much the evolution of what's happening with jails. And initially, jails in many cases are just kind of afterthoughts within many of these sort of frontier regions within the colony as a whole. And I think that's one of the big reasons why, when you see, in the 1850s and 1860s, most of these colonial districts in almost all of these colonial districts, they're essentially having a constable and a jailer, and they're usually one and the same. And it's a position of basically authority where you are the one who is responsible for not only the apprehension, but the imprisonment and also the maintenance of that imprisonment. And I think that's also, like, in the chapter where I talk about jails, the big focus I talk about as well is jailbreaks. And we see on multiple instances where the indigenous policemen, the Black policemen, are critically important when it comes to preventing individuals from escaping. And 9 times out of 10, the infrastructure that exists within these jails is nothing like a blockhouse or anything that you might imagine later on in the 19th and early 20th century. In many instances, it's a makeshift hut or a crawl in these cases. And in many instances, a lot of the prison escapes were just someone basically sneaking out the back because there wasn't a way to do it in these cases. And the fascinating thing about these jailbreaks, though, is when I was going through them, I always imagined when I said, oh, okay, this is a report of a prison break. Okay, well, I can see where this is going to go. The prisoners are going to escape, and the resident magistrate and the constable are going to blame the Africans, and they're the ones who are going to be, holding the bag when all is said and done. But it's actually fascinating that on multiple occasions, when these prison breaks occur, it's actually the European constable who is the one who is almost the most vocal defender of the Black policemen who are also acting as jailers in these instances. And I think it's a really telling because it illustrates not only that there is at least some sympathy that exists when it comes to the European officials of power in these situations, but there's also sort of an element of camaraderie that exists amongst these individuals. And I know again that's not anything entirely revelatory for anyone who actually studies the relationship between white and Black individuals within police institutions. But I think it's particularly telling that in this place, at this time, and in this sort of frontier setting, that many individuals sort of felt a kind of greater camaraderie with the individuals who they are working with side by side than the colonial official who is maybe visiting once every couple of weeks or the like. Okay, that doesn't mean, however, that there are not key cases of where the Black policemen are blamed in these instances. There's one instance I know in, I believe it was 1865, 1866, where there's a prison escape and three Africans are able to escape. And a fourth one is prevented from escaping because another white prisoner basically prevents him from escaping. And because that white prisoner prevents him from escaping, he is commended. His sentence is commuted, and he actually goes on and gets a job somewhere else. And most of the colonial records about this prison escape are commending this white prisoner who was in jail for preventing someone from escaping, and less of the black members of the constabulary, the Black jailers, who were actually running out and risking their lives to try to capture these people, out beyond the beyond the direct instant of the escape itself. So again, it's complicated, and it's something that I think, going back to this part of your question where you're talking about multiple roles, again, it goes back to the colonialism on the cheap. It goes back to this idea where if we can have one official fulfilling two roles, then that would seem to be a responsibility that would save a bit of money. And at the same time, it also becomes an incredible source of frustration for many of these individuals who are desperately attempting to have a new jail built or to get more assistance for their jailers as a whole. And I think it's also something that is, again, very much part of this formative component that's going on with Natal, because this becomes less of a problem in the later part of the 19th and the early 20th century because the system does become much more formalized. But because of the lack of formalization and because of just doing what is necessary to keep things kind of organized, it's kind of a Wild West component to it that I think is both fascinating, but also incredibly chaotic and difficult to track in many instances. But yeah, I really enjoyed the chapter related to jails just because I think it, like everything else in a microcosm, it illustrates all the complexities that are going on, the multiple roles that Africans are filling within this system, disputes over, who is responsible or who has agency within enforcing these regulations and rules within the colonial government. And then, of course, issues related to pay disputes and the like, which was a consistent theme throughout the entirety of this formative period.
Absolutely. And it's a related question to this your point about the complex and sometimes surprising relationships between white and black policemen. This question of the relationship of these of the black African policemen you're talking about to wider colonial society, and in different contexts, scholars have had different takes. That the colonial police, the ideal was in a sense to kind of isolate the indigenous constable from colonial society, but as others have observed, just putting on, well, a number at first in the case of Natal, and then a uniform later, did not automatically isolate you from the currents of colonial society. So I wondered how we should think about that aspect of the lives of these Black African colonial policemen.
So I think one of the really interesting components of this is that whenever the Black constabulary makes contact with the indigenous Black population, there is sort of an assumption that they are the figures of authority that are imposing colonial will. But when Black constables come in contact with the white elements of society, then they're not only attempting to impose colonial will, but they're also working within this balancing act of the racial order that exists within society as a whole. And in many instances, Black constables have to thread a very, very fine needle in these instances. In my chapter on violence, it is basically broken down into three sections. One is sort of the violence that's enacted by the police, oftentimes the use of their knob career, this club kind of walking stick that kind of becomes a symbol of the police institutions. But at the same time, also, it's specifically related to the violence against the police. And oftentimes, especially when it's reported, that violence is enacted by white citizenry against the policemen because of their lack of acknowledgement of the authority of these individuals. There's one particular incident where a Black constable is at a cricket match and basically attempting to walk across the field to his European constable supervisor, and basically because he thinks, oh yeah, one of these guys I think is an actual convict, and I think we should probably arrest him. And someone else randomly just comes out from the field and basically starts beating on the guy and knocks him down, like kicks him in the shins and does all this stuff. And when they ask why, he basically just says, I don't think this person, should have been walking on the field. He didn't see this person who had a badge, who was part of the colonial government, as a figure of authority. And I think one of the things that I wish I had done more in the book, and something that I would love to sort of see other scholars sort of dig into, is the discrepancy that really exists between the rural and urban sections of the colony. And I think that was a fault on mine, because I was basically desperately grabbing as many sources as I could and getting as much information as I could. And I think if I had some more time in the archives and I wasn't crunched in those instances, I think I really would have liked to have been able to discern the differentiation that was really occurring between the urban and rural sections. Part of that is because a lot of the rural constabulary, at least from the 1860s all the way to the 1880s, a lot of that is under the designation of the resident magistrates. Versus in the urban settings, a lot of the policing is actually under the control of the corporations of Durban and Pietermaritzburg. So it's sort of different elements of the colonial government that are essentially empowering these individuals. And by sort of highlighting the differentiation between that empowerment, I think we could have had a much clearer picture of sort of what, as you're saying, the experiences are like within those racial interactions between these different groups. And I think it's something that is, I'll acknowledge, lacking in the book, but also something that I think is a really important element to the story that you can glean a little bit by looking at all the case studies that I'm going into. But I think something that someone in the future, any professors out there who want ideas for their grad students, to kind of lean into and give I think a more clear picture of what's actually going on within this racial divide. At the same time, though, and I know I'm going on a bit, but at the same time, I think it also is part of the underpinnings of fear from the colonial population, especially the fear of sort of an armed African presence within the colony in proximity of these individuals. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the colonial government on multiple occasions, they ban Africans having possession of the stickies, the spears. They ban them having possessions of the Namkaris other than if you are a policeman in these instances. They ban them within the city limits because, again, this is where the majority of the white population is at least centered, and people don't want to be exposed to not even just violence itself, but I think what these items represent, which is a threat of violence and a perceived threat of violence that really, up until the Anglo-Zulu of 1879, is just hanging over everybody's head. This fear that Zulus are going to come right over the border and wipe out everyone within the colony. And I think that's something that's an undercurrent that exists throughout much of this formative period.
Well, no, and you weren't. I didn't think of you going on there because you actually had another. I had another question about violence and the police, and you answered that as well. So I think we're probably arriving at the point in time where we want to give others a chance to ask you questions about the book, things that we haven't talked about, or just things people had on their minds. So, Amanda,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for those wonderful questions. But yeah, if anyone in the audience has questions, you can either go ahead, Stuart, get started, raise your Zoom hand like that, or you can drop it in the chat and I'll read it out for you. But Stuart, go ahead.
If I put money down on who the first person was going to ask questions, it would be Stuart. Like, it just if I could put a tenner down on it, like, it would say I'm gonna say it's going to be Stuart.
All right, you don't answer the question, Jake, until it's been asked. All right, here we go. We look, the category of race. I noticed the book covers the period 1845 to 1899, and this is a period where the category of race itself is undergoing an enormous amount of flux. It's becoming more explicit. It's becoming more absolute. It's becoming more squarely anchored to social imaginaries. It's becoming a category, if you like. And in this same period, as we've just heard, policing is becoming professionalized and what have you. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about how those two processes intersected, interacted, to what extent that's a theme within the book, to what extent they were mutually reinforcing. Because I noticed with your title, I noticed this comma after the first term. So it's called a policing, race and the formation of British Colonial Natal. Could you have removed the comma? Policing race.
That's actually that's a really nice observation for it. And now you're making me regret the title, Stuart. Thank you. No, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the through lines throughout the entirety of the book is essentially this idea of how do we formalize this system of policing? How do we make it so that it's something that is both manageable and both understandable, but also something that fits within the colonial project that is being created within Natal as a whole? And I think it's fascinating because sort of like one of the first real examples of a organized official police force that is done within Natal is a police force that's established by Theophilus Shepstone in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And the idea is that this is going to be a sort of rapid response police force that can move around the colony and do, in essence, the aspects of enforcing law and order. And this is an idea that individuals are initially very enthusiastic about until, all right, we get into this, early 1850s where individuals start seeing these Africans actually patrolling and having weapons and moving through communities as a whole. And when they start seeing them as an organized and critically armed force, then the colonial population begins to become less enthusiastic. And when that force itself is actually dismissed and dissolved in the early 1850s, it's dissolved not just because there's a claim that it's too expensive or that it costs too much, but there's also this call as well that we don't need them. we don't need this Black police population. We can do it ourselves. And that actually leads into the creation of the Natal Mounted Police in the 1860s, because the idea, again, is that we can create this white force of individuals who are basically going to do everything that we need to do within the colony. But then at the same time, this white force is too expensive. They don't pay the guys. And when all is said and done, it fails as an organization. And not until it's sort of reestablished about a decade later in 1873. And as you go through the story, every time there's calls for police reform, those calls for police reform are to continue to separate the African from the white institutions. And there's this continued hope by the colonial officials that we're going to create this sort of like perfect white policing institution, all right, our own Royal Irish Constabulary, essentially, that is going to do the job that is required, and we don't need the African population. But every time it is done, it's obviously driven by the ideas of race. It's obviously driven the ideas of the racial fear that's connected to having Africans in positions of authority. But it always comes up against cost. It always comes up against that, well, this is going to cost X amount of money. And we already have these Black constables who are a hell of a lot cheaper. And what eventually occurs as you get into the post-1879 moment and the greater move that's going to act as kind of the precursor to Union in 1910 is the decision, when all is said and done, is that we have to accept that Black people are going to be within our police institutions. But we need to make sure that they do not have any position of authority or power within these institutions. We need to make sure that the officers, the people in charge, the individuals who are rank and file are obviously going to be white. And a big thing about this is, so there's an attempt to, in 1883, to create this thing called the Native Police Force. And it's this vision, all right, by this kind of idealist guy by the name of Knight, who basically says, we're going to create this 200-man force. It's going to have white officers. It's going to have Black policemen, and it is going to be completely formalized. It's not going to be like magistrate to magistrate kind of thing. It's going to be a truly colonial police force. But the big contention is not only pay, but also Knight's request to, well, can I pay a little bit more for sergeants or indunas, as they were called in these instances? Can I pay a little bit more for these individuals who are respected within their community, have status within their community, but don't want to just be rank and file? And the colonial government basically says no. And on the surface, they say no because it's too expensive. But what's really happening is they're questioning up, well, no, we have white officers. Why would we need Black NCOs? Why would we need individuals who are anything other than white in this system of authority? And I think, going back to your last point, Stuart, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think I could remove the comma, because what's going on here is you are essentially policing who has power within this racialized context and who is restricting power within these racialized contexts. And, when all is said and done, even though, Africans still maintain the majority of the police force throughout through the apartheid era as well. All right. But at least through, the 19th and early 20th century with the Natal, it is a lack of acknowledgement of the ability of a lack of acknowledgement of who is in charge within that racialized order. And I think it becomes much, much more solidified, as you rightly point out, as we get towards the end of the 19th century. Because you begin in the 1840s with colonial administrators saying, cool, we'll have this big, police force. It'll do the job as necessary because we're not really worried about it. And then in that post, admittedly, it's post, 1857 moment, honestly, where that fear of, well, we don't want an indigenous uprising. We don't want these individuals taking over and slaughtering us. So how do we keep them under control, but still use them within the system?
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
No,
Yeah, that's a great question, Stuart. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. So any other questions from the audience? Chuck, go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much, Amanda. Jacob, really enjoyed the conversation. I haven't quite gotten to the book yet. It's on my short list. But one thing, just hearing you talk about it is I've done a good bit of work at the foundation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829. And it's just remarkable how similar so many of these issues are. Not wanting to spend money. In this case, it's working class officers that nobody wants to trust. And in many ways, some of these officers just get really beat up between a public that hates them, the magistrates who really just do not trust them. And it plays out in a lot of issues in the way that you're talking about. And but one in particular, I guess I wanted to ask you is there anything in your records about policing sexuality or gender sexuality? I know from mine in one case in particular, right? Working class men were sort of making some decisions at the divisional level. And so they went into Hyde Park at night in plain clothes to entrap men cruising for sex. Of course, if you're a working class man going in plain clothes, you dress as a working class man, which means middle and upper class men were picking them up. And these were brought before the courts, and there was a huge scandal within like the first couple of months of the police. So I'm wondering, just is there anything at all in your records that sort of might play into issues like that?
No, absolutely. So I think one of the big, going to your first point associated with sort of like these working class individuals and the like, I think one of the big issues, especially when it came to issues of pay and the like, notably amongst the members of the Black Constabulary, was a lack of acknowledgement by the colonial officials that these are individuals who are essentially having to take care of their families. These are individuals who have to go home and make sure that their families are fed and the like. And there's actually a hilarious there's a hilarious component. There's a category of policing that are called the patrol police, and these patrol police are sort of, you could kind of call them like temporary police or assigned for a specific task or something along those lines. And most of these patrol police actually aren't paid. What they aren't paid in cash, at least. What they're paid for oftentimes is in rations. And talking about the domestic sphere, many of these policemen essentially started arguing, well, we're just going out on patrols and we're coming back home. We don't need rations because our wives make a hell of a lot better food than the food that you're giving us in these instances. And in essence, that like this argument, no, we want to get paid in cash because that's going to be much more beneficial for us. All right. When it comes to the issues of gender in those cases, that's one aspect that I really wish I could have found more within the archives. And I think a lot of that comes specifically to sort of the nature of Indigenous voices and what we can actually find of Indigenous voices within the archives. The one component that I will say that has like a very gendered component, though, a lot of times is the issue of violence, and the issue of violence that's implemented specifically against women by members of the African police in these cases. And I think what happens in these instances is, women, both white and Black, are often presented as a illustration of the classical gender dynamics that exist. So Black women who are attacked by the police are going to be presented as individuals who are victims of this quote unquote savage brute that is representative of the policing. But even in those instances, there is sort of a very typical, stereotypical in many instances, presentation of masculinity amongst those police as a whole. And I cannot believe that that is the case universally. And part of that is because I know for a fact, like there are instances where there's one particular case where an individual who I'm fairly certain is what's called a cola intellectual, person who was essentially educated by missionaries, is a Black man, is brutally beaten by the police, and his fiance wife the next day is there, and from all accounts she is also African, possibly mixed race. Again, it's kind of difficult to see within the archival components, but she in the narratives is almost completely dismissed as a victim of this violence. And instead, the violence is focused on the Black man who is the target of both the magistrate and the two Black constables that are with him as a whole. And I just want one more letter. I just want one more letter about the relationship between these two individuals, because there is no reason why this guy was attacked, other than the fact that he is walking down the road, he's a Black man, and he has a woman, and he has an Indigenous woman with him. But there has to be some subtext to it. And I think that subtext has to do a lot with sort of perceptions of, interracial, potentially interracial relationships. I think it also has subtext associated with perceptions of Africans with women who are not stereotypically Indigenous, because both of these individuals are in Western dress. But I think also part of it has to do with potentially some self-loathing, potentially something else is going on there. But Chuck, I would love to tell you that I found instances like that in the archives, and I just didn't. And I would absolutely adore it if I can. TJ Tolley has actually written a fantastic book called on Colonial Natal, and the title is escaping me, dear God. I've written a review of it. But yes, TJ Tolley, and he's written a fantastic book on looking at using ostensibly sort of this kind of queer lens in sort of understanding the power dynamics of race that exists within Natal. And he has actually several great cases of police interaction in there that I think. But again, even he's reading between the lines a little bit in these cases, because again, it's the understanding that type of subtext, I have difficulty finding it. And if someone does find it at some point, I will be utterly ecstatic on that end. But yeah, I am frustrated with myself in these cases that there isn't more examinations of issues of gender and issues of sexuality within this book, because I think it is, as you rightly point out, a key part of police life. But again, if maybe in a couple of maybe another decade when I can go back to the archives, we'll see. But thanks, Chuck. I appreciate the question.
Great answer. Thanks very much.
Yep.
Thanks, Chuck. We are coming up on time, but Amelia, I see you've got a question, so if you can keep it really quick, then go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. The time wise, I got here late because I thought it was 5 and it should have been 4. Anyway, Jake, fantastic, well done. I'm sure I'm going to get the rest from you in anyway, but just briefly a question about first-hand accounts from you may have said something about that already, but I know from my own work that sometimes that can be very limited. So how did you find anything, or how did you work around that?
Yeah, and Amelia, we'll talk more about this. But yeah, no, again, it's sort of reading between the lines, but a lot of times, as sort of I mentioned earlier, is this idea you have to find specific case studies and hold on to them for dear life, and basically use them as your kind of North Stars to provide further evidence of what is filling in the rest of the gaps within the narrative and the story. Again, the vast majority of the accounts that I have are written by white officials, are presented by white officials, but when when policemen give depositions, when they give evidence at trials. Yeah.
So it's mostly officials, the side of story then,
yeah. When they're providing that when they're providing their voice in these instances, it is a critical thing that you have to hold on to in those cases. Yeah. But again, it's a supreme difficulty, especially when you're dealing with the 19th century, especially when you're dealing with sort of this level of archival collection, as you know. And it's something I think is very much one thing I'm really proud of in the book is, as Michael presented, I think I've done a pretty decent job in bringing out stories that have not been told, and stories of individuals who have kind of been, borrowing from Trio, sort of like silenced within the archives. And I think it's something that if I'm most proud of one thing for the book, it is that. That I have been able to bring out these stories that, again, I really hope that some grad student, a decade from now can latch on to and
Well, I
find a
look
bunch more
forward to
information
reading
about.
it.
Perfect. Thanks,
Thank you
Amelia.
very much.
Thanks, Amelia.
It's a good read.
All right, so with that, we are up with time. So I want to just thank everyone for coming today, and I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Jacob and Michael for such a wonderful discussion.
Especially Jacob.
Yes, thank you to Jacob for sharing your work with us. We have a few more events this semester, so check the website and hope to see some of you at some of those events as well. But for now, thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.